Dragon Age the Veilguard's got some tough fights to throw at you on Underdog and Nightmare difficulties, especially if you take on some of the optional side bosses early on. Like, did you know that you can stack Critical Strike, Vulnerable, and Weak Spot damage all on the same attack? Let's learn about different types of attacks, significant enemy vulnerabilities, contextual buffs, and the super important build your own combo crit system. I was offered to make a sponsored video on the game and they said that I could do whatever I wanted. I decided to be a typical PoE enjoyer and spend more time build planning than actually playing. I dove into the nitty-gritty on game mechanics to figure out what depth the combat and character building can offer us. Here's what I've burned 50 hours on messing around with instead of actually finishing the game. While Veilguard does have a much more action-oriented combat style, there's a lot of pretty crunchy RPG mechanics going on. Vulnerabilities and resistances for each different type of enemy and different health bars that they can have. And all of these things want different combinations of elements and attack styles, as well as different abilities and party compositions. Now, if you're playing on Storyteller or normal difficulty, you probably don't really need to know most of this video, but you may have even more fun becoming quite overpowered if you at least kind of get to understand attack types, health bars, and maybe the crit system a little bit. The highest difficulties, however, will need you to know most of this unless you want to struggle and wonder why enemies feel like such damage sponges. It's because your DPS is bad. But before we get into the thick of it, one big pro tip, enable the combat text display in the interface settings. It'll tell you what is a weak point or vulnerable damage so that you can figure out what you're doing is working and what isn't working. It took me way too long and a lot of testing that I did before I discovered that this was an option. So let's talk about the game's damage effectiveness system. There's 5 different types of damage effectiveness that you can deal whenever you hit an enemy with something. Resisted, which is dealing less damage, obviously. And normal, which is exactly what it sounds like. Then there's vulnerable, which is an enemy being weak to an element or attack type. Then there's weak spot, which is things like headshots with bows. And then criticals, which are triggered under certain specific circumstances. We'll go over that later. You basically never want to be doing resisted damage or even normal if you can help it. You always want to be doing some combination of vulnerable, weak spot, or critical damage as much as possible, which means using the right skills, the right attack types, the right elements against the right enemies. Interestingly, you can stack these different damage boosts. So here, for example, I do a critical strike triggered by the final blow of an attack chain. This is thanks to the rogue's powerful rebuttal passive, which when you do a successful defend, a parry, that grants you a stack of precision, which makes your next final attack or charged attack do a guaranteed crit. So you can see I do about 100 damage on the normal hits and 150 critical damage with that crit. But here I do the same thing with a rune activated to give me corrosive damage, which this guy's vulnerable to. My regular attacks do 150, which was the crit damage before, and the critical is instead 215. That's about 50 damage more per different damage boost, vulnerable and crit, and a bit extra from the rune on top. All up, I'm doing more than double damage for using the right rune here in my build against this specific enemy. And this is something I learned because this guy was very hard when I first encountered him, but then after I changed a few things around and learned a bit about it, I was able to really dominate the fight. Interesting side note, the math from my little test here seems to indicate that the damage increases are additive, not multiplicative. So the 50% increased from crit and the 50% increased from vulnerable are added together for a total of 100% increase or double damage, making it 200, and the extra 15 is likely the rune's 10% damage bonus with just that, plus 5 or 10 damage. The extra 15 damage is likely the rune's 10% damage bonus with a bit of variance. Math. Remember that from companion skills, for example, you can apply vulnerable to the enemies to make them take more damage, and adrenaline to you to make you deal more damage on top of these other things. So it's easy to see that 215 go to like 300 or 400 potentially. Discovering how you can stack these things together, which attacks and which gear and abilities and companion abilities and all of those things stacked together against which specific enemies, that's where a lot of the fun nuance and experimentation is in the game. A lot of that's for you to figure out as you go for your build, but I'll give you some tools to be able to do so effectively. So let's talk about attack types. I found it a bit confusing at first. The game tries to explain it, but I got a little turned around on what was heavy, what was charged and everything. So let me lay it out nice and clean for you. Left click on PC is the light attack. This can be chained into a combo. And then shift left click is a heavy attack. For rogue, that can be chained into a combo, and I believe the other classes do a big single hit with it. And then your right click is your ranged attack. So this is the bow on the rogue or the shield throw on the warrior, for example. Importantly, this can do weak spot damage with things like headshots or, hitting weak spots. So those are your 3 main attacks, light, heavy, and ranged, with left click, shift left click, and then right click. And then there's charged attacks of each of those. So a charged attack is when you click and hold any of those things. So if you click and hold a shift left click, that's a charged heavy attack. And if you click and hold right click, you'll do a charged ranged attack. Fun side note is there's some interesting little nuances here, like the longbow on the rogue, for example, has 2 charge stages, whereas the shortbow only has 1. But the difference between like a light and heavy attack and a charged light and heavy attack is pretty important because there are some enemies that really need you to use those. And there are some very powerful passives and things that you can do with those charged attacks. Like, for example, charged attacks can often interrupt enemies, causing them to actually stumble and stop their attack. This even works on larger bosses with major channeled abilities, for example. You can just break them out of the channel by doing charged attacks on them. There's also one other type of little attack as well. That's the agile attacks. Any attack from like jumping or sprinting or falling, for example, where you do like a downward stab or something like that, or some flip. Those are all agile attacks. Those are only really ever important when a specific passive skill says something happens with them. For example, like you do a critical strike against a knocked down enemy with an agile attack, for example, like a jumping attack. So each class varies a bit on how each of these different attacks feel, but the categories of what they are and their main use cases do remain, for the most part, the same. But depending on your build or your gear, for example, you might favor certain attacks where it isn't super detrimental for you to use them. And in some cases, you can even overcome some of the weaknesses. Like, for example, spamming melee attacks against barrier enemies is pretty weak, but there are some runes and gear that can actually make you do a bunch of bonus damage with that to make that actually a viable choice. Despite it literally being the wrong thing to do, you can build away from that being a problem. The next really important thing is the 4 health types that enemies can have. So red normal health, yellow armor and blue barrier, and the blighted orange bar. And then there's one other little bar, the stagger bar, more on that later. Different attack types and status effects all have majorly different levels of effectiveness on these different types of health bars. And proper skills, gear, and attack types chosen on a moment-to-moment basis, but also on a build-to-encounter basis, is very important here and can have a major difference in tougher fights. So the red health bar is obviously pretty straightforward because there's no real major impact on the effectiveness of attack and damage types, with a few exceptions. Generally speaking, light attack spam is pretty effective against health red bar enemies, but the bleed fizz status ailment deals bonus damage to health. So any skills like the Rogue's Pilfer ability, for example, that apply bleeds can be a good way to whittle down a higher health boss. Next up is the armored enemies, the yellow bar enemies. Heavy attacks deal bonus damage to armor, and the burning fire status ailment, damage over time, does more damage against armor as well. So heavy attacks and burning to chip away that armor until you get them down to health, and then you can spam your light attacks. The barrier is the blue bar, and this is a little bit more complicated. Barrier will recharge if the enemy's not damaged for a while, and barrier tends to appear on enemies that are a little bit more tricksy, like mages that teleport around and run away from you. Thankfully, you can task your companions to attack barrier enemies, and they'll maintain attacks on them so they won't get the chance to recover. Or you can do things like apply damage over time effects to them to keep the pressure on them so their barrier won't recharge. And it just so happens that ranged attacks, your right click, deals bonus damage to barrier. So when those pesky mages are teleporting away, use those ranged attacks to take them down and get rid of that barrier. Your strongest tool against barrier by far is the fact that ranged deals bonus damage, but ranged can also get weak spots. So that's 2 built-in multipliers that you can take advantage of right off the bat without any specific build elements coming into effect. So if you headshot a barrier mage with your bow, and then if you make that a charged attack as well for a bunch of bonus damage, you can one-shot the barrier most of the time. On regular enemies at least. Bosses, can be a different story. The necrosis, damage over time, status affliction, deals bonus damage to barrier as well, so keep that one in mind. Since dots are already really good at keeping up pressure on barrier enemies, necrosis is extra good. And then with all of the armored, barrier, and health enemies, do keep in mind that some gear and passive skills gives bonuses to specific damage types against specific bars. So for example, light attacks might not normally be very good against barrier enemies, but there is definitely gear that you can equip that gives you like a nice bonus against that. And there's even runes that can do things like remove the damage penalty for using the wrong attack against the wrong bar, for example. Then next up is that blighted orange bar. For the longest time, I confused this for armor, and I was like, why do sometimes I need to do charged attacks and why do sometimes I need to do heavy attacks? I don't understand. It says heavy attacks here, and it says charged here. I was getting very confused. The orange bar and the yellow bar are different things. The blighted bar also has like a little blight symbol on the left of it too. So, and the blighted enemies are generally more significant enemies in areas that have blight in them. So there's a lot of indicators there that I missed. Charged attacks deal bonus damage to armor. And the thing about this is that they'll take very little damage from non-charged attacks as well. And since those charged attacks do leave you quite vulnerable while you're doing that big channel to get that big hit off, and because Blighted tends to appear on naturally harder enemies, you're going to have to stagger enemies, parry them, or really pick your moments carefully to hit them with your big charged attacks. The good news is you have other tools here. Big ranged headshot crits. When you charge up, your ranged attack still count as a charged attack, and that extra weak spot damage is very effective there. And you can also use abilities even if they're not the ideal damage type unless they're explicitly resisted by that specific type of enemy. These can still be pretty effective at doing some hit and run tactics to try and get rid of that blight bar. Especially if you do start taking advantage of any other damage modifiers, critical effects, or vulnerabilities, for example. So maybe that specific blighted enemy is weak to necrosis damage, for example. Now, the final bar that appears above the enemies as they take damage is the Stagger Bar, the little light purple one that fills up. Stagger's a special kind of damage that's dealt independently of their regular health to the Stagger Bar instead of their life. And when it fills up, they're knocked down for an extended period of time. They're staggered. During this time, you can do whatever you want and finish off with a takedown, a special contextual heavy attack that deals a lot of damage. Stagger damage is dealt while dealing other damage, but everything has differing levels of stagger effectiveness. And you'll even notice, for example, that different weapons have different amounts of stagger compared to their damage. Generally, heavier weapons, for example, doing more stagger damage, but maybe being slower or a bit worse in some other regard. Or maybe the lighter weapons have, for example, armor penetration instead. Abilities deal somewhat consistent amounts of stagger damage, though some abilities have specifically large buffs to their stagger damage. Like, for example, the Rogue's ultimate throws down a bunch of bombs that deal high stagger damage. So these can be great for building up those staggers. And the Overwhelm status effect from the different Primus skills, both on you and your companions, increases stagger damage taken. And this is a direct multiplier to the incoming stagger damage, so it's pretty effective, especially combined with other things that are doing high stagger damage. And this is where you should really start to consider the fact that it may be worth not always detonating Overwhelmed right away. The game hands you this primer detonation system right on a silver platter and makes it really easy to do, and it's fun and it does big damage and does an explosion. It's really satisfying. It's very good at clearing packs, and it certainly does a big hit of damage. But leaving the enemy overwhelmed instead of detonating that status effect and then comboing other abilities that do a ton of stagger damage might well get that enemy staggered and, you know, set you up for a big combo and a lot more damage in the long run. Finally, for Stagger, Shocked, the damage over time status effect for lightning, is very effective for staggering, as the damage over time itself deals an equal amount of stagger damage unique to Shock. So in addition to the different health bars having different attack types that the enemies are vulnerable to or resistant to, different certain enemies have vulnerabilities and resistances all of their own in addition to that. So for example, this chunky boy, the Qamekmaster, is vulnerable to necrotic damage but resistant to electricity. That's just specific to him. We also know that bleed is effective against him too, as he's got a life bar, right? He's all life bar, this guy. Other life-based enemies aren't necessarily going to be weak to necrotic damage. Usually necrotic is the thing that's good against barrier enemies, right? So already we have a nice triple combination of things to consider. Light attacks, bleed, and necrotic damage are all going to be very effective against this guy. But then there's other things to start considering too. He's resistant to electricity, means he's actually pretty hard to stagger. He's a pretty big, thick boy. He's not really going to get staggered very easily, maybe once per fight. But he's actually very predictable, and his parry timings are pretty easy. He's almost like a parry practice dummy. So we can start to form our strategy here around parrying, and then doing critical vulnerability combos with the right attacks and the right elements, all while he's stunned from the parry. And this strategy combines all these things together to make otherwise a pretty hard fight into an actually pretty easy one. It was night and day after I figured this stuff out. So make sure that you enable that advanced combat text in the options and pay attention to what is resisting what that you're doing and what is vulnerable to what. Because you know which attack types enemies are vulnerable to, like if they're armor and you're doing heavy attacks, they're vulnerable to that, then you can start to narrow down on what other thing they might be resisting or vulnerable to. And there is like a logic to it, certain factions having different flavors, for example, certain enemy types, but I'll let you have the fun of discovering that. And that brings us to runes. The runes in general allow you to solve a lot of problems, such as your build being a bit weak against a certain faction or not really having access to a vulnerable damage type for a specific boss. You can potentially change like a whole bunch of your skills whenever you want. Respecking is pretty easy and free, but you can also just change runes on the fly, and often that can be enough to tilt the odds in your favor significantly. Runes can have other effects besides just changing your elemental damage. You can even do things like apply status ailments that can set you up for different combos, or make it so that you can spam melee attacks against barrier enemies, for example, without them resisting it. It's perfect if you're built around melee combos. So I'm pretty used to games typically having like a percentage chance to crit, or maybe like weak spots, like headshots being crits. That's often the case in other games, so it took me a while to figure out what they actually are here and how they work. Critical strikes are all triggered on an attack or ability that says it will crit when a specific conditions are met. That's all, it's that simple. Your skills will say something, for example, like, if you hit a burning enemy with this skill, it'll be a critical strike. And nearly everything in the game has some sort of critical condition it can take advantage of. That said, that's where the complexity comes in, because there are dozens of these different types of conditions and variables and things that can lead to you critting. Basically, like, every source of critical strike is unique to that passive skill, ability, or piece of gear. Abilities generally have like a critical strike condition for if the enemy is affected by a specific affliction. So for example, things like Rogue's Static Strike, critting burning enemies, which is pretty common for lightning abilities to do that. Just look at the details page for your different abilities and look for those combos. And do remember that the companion abilities can also crit, and make sure to check them because they can actually have some pretty interesting different things. Like for example, Lucanus's abilities critting on chilled or shocked enemies. He actually has 2 crit conditions for his abilities there. There are many passives that give you some crit condition as well, like for example, Rogue's Precision Shot ability, allowing you to effectively chain crit with charged bow shots if you can successfully keep them going. So the game kind of sets you up to focus on detonators, and they're great fun, but it's effectively the game the devs just handing you like a nice obvious combo for players who don't really want to think too hard. And they can be nice easy 1-2 button pushes for a bunch of damage when you can't set up a bigger combo. But I think for you, watching this video, if you'll allow me to pander for a second here, are a bit more clever than that. In many cases, once you actually start to dig into it, you'll find that it's far better to at least not detonate right away. Now, a word on parrying, since it's come up pretty often here. I suck at parrying in most games that call for it. I will dodge roll until I die in Souls games, which is coincidentally very often. I just never seem to parry in these games. But even on the harder difficulties, I've found it to be very doable in certain situations here. It's just super rewarding as well, to the point that effective parrying can completely change the tone of an otherwise very hard boss fight. And that's because most parries knock the enemy down or leave them vulnerable for a significant amount of time. It's almost as good as Stagger, but it can be done way more often. I will still tend to evade spam in hectic fights with lots of enemies, just because parrying one specific enemy when you're getting shot in the back by another one, it's much safer to dodge roll a lot of the time. But against major foes and elites, bosses, I'm always looking for a parry because that's how you get your big damage. And the reason why I think it is a lot more doable and enjoyable in this game than it is for people like myself who suffer parrying in other games is because of this indicator system. So the white indicator always means that a yellow attack will follow. The yellow indicator will appear, which is when you can parry. There is a red indicator, which shows an attack cannot be parried and must be dodged instead. So big unblockable attacks. The good news is that the red indicator will never appear after the white indicator. So a white indicator always means there's a safe parry opportunity coming up. And the secondary effect of that is that you have like a prompt for your brain to latch onto. So it only takes like a little bit of practice, and that kind of like indicator system is way easier, I think, for your brain to latch onto than trying to have to, learn each specific attack on each specific enemy. Now the parries do still vary from enemy to enemy and attack to attack. That indicator is always consistent across all fights, right? And if you're struggling a bit and want to parry more but still can't manage it even with some practice and even with knowing that about the indicators, then do remember that you can customize the parry timing in the options. Ultimately, make the game settings make you have more fun with the game. One other big tip here that is super fun, abilities can dodge enemy attacks. So most abilities that lock you into some form of animation actually make you immune to damage during the entire animation. You can use this to your advantage to tank gigantic hits and keep up the attack. I'll often push a combo way beyond safe timing and just rely on using one of my abilities to ignore the punishment I very rightfully should be getting in return. It's super satisfying to do, and it lets you like deal damage instead of dodge rolling away. I like to use the Rogue's Pilfer ability because it's very fast to activate, so you can use it almost as like an emergency, oh no, I'm gonna get hit button. Instead, I'm attacking you and healing myself and applying a bleed. So fun. It's powerful to the point that I actually tend to leave my abilities unused and not use them right off cooldown so that I can use them on the next attack that the enemy's going to do at me that I can't parry. So there's tons of status effects, combos, and uniques, especially as the game progresses. You can start adding extra effects to your gear, even beyond what is initially obvious. So there's a lot of fun stuff there for you to figure out, but I think hopefully these foundations can help you make the most of those options and have a bit more fun. And don't forget, respeccing here is super easy, so change things up from time to time to take advantage of new gear and companion unlocks. I was genuinely surprised at the depth here to the party building and combat and character building mechanics. Given that the series has become more action combat oriented, I was fully ready to, not have to think too much and just have fun blasting. And I was, planning to make a video about, I don't know, like the trade systems or the faction or the progression system or something like that, but the combat and the character building here had a lot of meat to it. So this is the guide I chose to make instead. I guess it's a bit like how going from turn-based roguelikes to the action RPG genre in my main games didn't mean a loss of depth at all, quite the opposite in fact. There's a lot going on when you move to real time. Ultimately, I just wanted to make this specific video so that you could maybe have a bit more fun with your playthrough and discover a bit more of that nuance and take advantage of it. There's some pretty fun stuff to play with here. Anyway folks, that's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks very much for watching.